Denver, Colorado, was submerged in the cold, golden light of a luxurious winter night where the massive glass facade of the Sterling Grand Hotel mirrored the entire city like a painting created exclusively for the super rich, while a long line of Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and Lamborghinis queued up before the main entrance under crystal lights, making the whole street look like a lavish exhibition straight out of a movie about American billionaires. Inside the main ballroom, over 300 guests were raising champagne glasses amidst soft jazz and conversations that smelled of money as entrepreneurs, influencers, celebrities, and investors constantly took photos in front of the giant glowing logo of Hayes Prestige Motors at the center of the stage. Tonight was the launch of the new Supercar collection from Hayes Prestige Motors, Denver's most famous luxury car brand, and it was also the most anticipated appearance of Victoria Hayes, the young CEO the media was calling the new icon of American wealth. Victoria walked onto the stage to prolonged applause, a chic black dress hugging her perfect figure under the soft golden lights, while behind her a giant LED screen displayed images of five-star hotels, supercar showrooms, and the hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts Hayes Prestige Motors had signed in the past year. She held a champagne flute, smiling with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of every room. My father used to say that success isn't just what's in your bank account, but the legacy we leave behind for the next generation. Applause erupted again. Cameras flashed incessantly. A famous influencer live streaming near the stage laughed into his phone. This place literally looks like a billionaire fantasy tonight. The music continued to play until a strange sound emerged from outside the hotel. The sound of an old horse engine sputtering and vibrating as if it had just driven halfway across the city just to get here. A few guests frowned and turned their heads. An old dark green Ford Mustang slowly pulled into the valet area amidst the long line of gleaming supercars, making the entire luxurious scene feel jarringly out of place for a few brief seconds. The paint on the car's body was faded with time. One of the headlights was slightly cracked. Its engine rumbled heavily, a stark contrast to the smooth purr of the Ferraris and Bentleys, causing a few valets to exchange annoyed glances. A man in a tuxedo burst out laughing as he looked at the car. There's no way that thing belongs to a guest tonight. Immediately, a few influencers started swiveling their phones towards the Mustang, as if they had just found something more amusing than the million-dollar supercars behind it. The car finally came to a stop right before the red carpet leading into the hotel. The car door opened slowly. Ethan Miller stepped out in a worn gray shirt, frayed at the cuffs, with a dark jacket over it that still had a few faint grease stains. His old shoes were a complete contrast to the polished leather ones stepping through the hotel lobby behind him. But it wasn't Ethan's clothes that caught people's attention. It was the calm, almost cold expression on his face. He closed the car door very gently, as if that old Mustang was the most precious thing he owned. A valet quickly approached with a forced, polite smile. "Excuse me, sir. This area is for invited guests only," Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze looking past the valet, through the large glass walls of the hotel where the golden lights and laughter of the wealthy elite continued. "I know. I'm here to see Victoria Hayes." The valet glanced back at the car, then frowned slightly. "I believe you're at the wrong place, sir." On the other side of the red carpet, the laughter grew louder, as an influencer deliberately zoomed his camera in on the old Mustang. "Look at this, you guys. Someone actually drove this to a billionaire's supercar event." A group of young guests started laughing. A girl covered her mouth and whispered to her friend that the car wasn't even worth as much as the watch she was wearing. But Ethan still didn't react. He simply opened the passenger side door and carefully retrieved an old silver metal box scratched and worn over the years. An object that looked completely out of place in this lavish setting. The valet's frown deepened as he looked at the box. Just then, a cold gust of wind blew past, causing the Mustang's back door to creak open slightly, revealing a child's blue backpack and a few drawings inside. One piece of paper slid gently onto the seat. It was a child's crude crayon drawing. The picture showed the old Mustang and a man holding a little girl's hand in front of a small garage. Above the drawing, written in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Me and Daddy." Ethan held the metal box with both hands, as if he had been guarding it for many, many years. Just then, the grand glass doors of the ballroom swung open. Victoria Hayes stepped out, flanked by several investors and her security team, still wearing the perfect smile of a CEO, until her gaze landed on the old Mustang parked amidst a lineup of Rolls-Royces and Ferraris. The smile on Victoria's face vanished almost instantly. An investor standing beside her frowned in annoyance. Victoria looked Ethan up and down, her eyes growing cold as if his very presence was staining the perfect evening she had spent months preparing. "Who let you in here?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make everyone around fall silent. Ethan took a slow step forward. "I only came to return something that belongs to your family." Victoria glanced at the old metal box in Ethan's hands and scoffed. "Do you really think this is the place for cheap publicity stunts?" All around them, phones were still recording. The live streams kept rolling. An influencer whispered to their camera that things were getting extremely interesting. Victoria crossed her arms, her eyes filled with undisguised contempt. "The Sterling Grand is not a place for people like you." Then she turned to security. "Escort him out of here before the press gets any more pictures." Two guards immediately stepped forward, but Ethan stood his ground. No anger, no shouting, no attempt to explain. He just looked directly at Victoria with an unnervingly calm gaze, then gently placed a hand on the hood of his old Mustang. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "This car saved your father's life." After Ethan's words, the atmosphere in front of the Sterling Grand Hotel shifted completely. The old Mustang, sitting silently amidst a long line of Ferraris and Rolls-Royces, looked like an accidental stain on the world of the super-rich, and the surrounding gazes began to shift from curiosity to ridicule as they realized the man standing before Victoria Hayes was not the kind of guest this establishment wanted to see in tomorrow's papers. Victoria stared at Ethan for a few more seconds, as if weighing whether he was a madman or just trying to create a cheap spectacle in front of the wealthy crowd behind her. Then she scoffed. "Do you have any idea what event this is tonight?" Ethan remained perfectly calm. "I do." "Then you should understand that this is no place for someone driving a car that's one step away from the junkyard to come and cause a scene." A few nearby guests laughed along. The chatter of live streaming phones grew louder as influencers realized this scene was pulling in far more views than the collection of multi-million-dollar supercars in the ballroom. A young man in a tuxedo moved in closer to get a better shot of Ethan, then laughed loudly. "Man, this dude looks like a homeless mechanic who took the wrong exit off the highway." Laughter immediately rippled through the crowd. A woman dripping in diamonds shook her head in disgust. "I don't understand why security hasn't thrown him out yet." Victoria crossed her arms, her eyes turning to ice, feeling personally insulted on her company's most important night. She turned to her security team. "Get him out of here now." Two security guards stepped forward, but Ethan stood motionless beside his old Mustang. As if the laughter surrounding him couldn't touch him at all, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't argue. He just tightened his grip slightly on the metal box in his hand and looked at Victoria with a calmness that was almost unsettling. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to return something that belongs to the Hayes family." Victoria laughed again. "My family isn't missing anything." "Perhaps that's what you think." Ethan's short reply silenced some of the onlookers for a moment. A cold wind swept across the red carpet, dusting his old coat with light snow, while behind the hotel's glass walls, the sound of jazz and clinking champagne glasses continued. Two completely different worlds existing side by side, separated by only a few feet. An investor standing next to Victoria spoke in a low voice. "If the press runs this picture tomorrow morning, it won't be good for the brand." Victoria clutched her purse tighter. She felt all eyes turning to her instead of the supercar collection inside the ballroom. It was the one thing she hated most: losing control. She took another step down the stairs and looked directly at Ethan. "You really think my father had anything to do with that car?" Ethan nodded slightly. "It was more than that. He used to sit in the garage with me, working on it for nights on end." Victoria froze for a moment. Some of the people nearby grew even quieter than before. Ethan continued in a slow, deliberate voice. "Years ago, before Hayes Prestige Motors even had its first showroom in Denver, your father used to stop by my old garage at night. He preferred to fix cars himself rather than hire someone else to do it." Victoria frowned. Her father had passed away 3 years ago. The entire public image of Richard Hayes was that of a luxurious businessman, always seen with private helicopters, five-star hotels, and million-dollar contracts. No one ever mentioned an old garage. No one ever mentioned a faded Mustang. And no one ever mentioned a man like Ethan Miller. A nearby influencer started whispering to their camera that this story was starting to sound more like a Netflix drama than a random scandal. Victoria was losing her patience. That's enough. She turned to the guards again. Get him out of here before he makes up any more stories about my family. A guard reached out to touch Ethan's shoulder, but just then the phone in Ethan's coat pocket buzzed. The sound was faint, but it was enough to make him pause. Ethan looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. The voice of a little girl could be heard, faint against the cold wind. Daddy. Ethan's expression immediately softened. Yeah, Lily. On the other end of the line, the faint sound of a neighbor's TV mingled with the scratching of crayons on paper. Daddy, did they like Grandpa Richard's car? His daughter's innocent question made Ethan fall silent for a few seconds. People nearby began to overhear. Ethan turned slightly to shield the phone from the wind. You're not asleep yet? I'm waiting for you to come home. Lily giggled softly on the other end of the line. Mrs. Carter made hot chocolate for me. Ethan looked down at his old Mustang and exhaled slowly. Be home soon, Daddy. Yeah? Grandpa Richard said good people always keep their promises, right? For a moment, Ethan's gaze faltered. Behind him, the mocking laughter had died down considerably. Ethan gave a small nod, though Lily couldn't see him. That's right. The call ended. A strange silence fell over the red carpet area. For the first time, Victoria realized the man in front of her wasn't the type to show up looking for a handout or trying to cause a scene. He was just trying to fulfill a promise, but her ego was still stronger than the uneasy feeling growing inside her. Victoria coldly stepped closer. If it's money you want, just name your price. Ethan looked at her for a few seconds, then gave a slight shake of his head. If I wanted money, I would have sold this years ago. He glanced at the metal box in his hand. I kept it because your father saved my family when no one else would. Victoria was about to retort, but just as the lights from the entrance reflected off the old silver box in Ethan's hand, she suddenly saw a line of text engraved deep into the time-worn, scratched metal. Richard Hayes, 1979. The atmosphere in front of the Sterling Grand Hotel grew strangely silent after Victoria saw her father's name engraved on the old metal box. Richard Hayes, 1979. The engraving didn't look like something that could be faked for a few brief hours of attention. It was hand-engraved, deep old, as if it had existed for decades. Victoria was silent for a few seconds, but her gaze began to shift ever so slightly as she looked at the silver box in Ethan's hand. Around them, phones were still recording. The live stream still had thousands of viewers. But the laughter from moments ago had almost completely vanished. An investor standing behind Victoria spoke in a low voice. You knew about this? Victoria didn't answer. She just stepped closer and held out her hand. Give me the box. Ethan looked at her for a few seconds before slowly handing over the metal box. Victoria took it cautiously, as if for the first time in years, she was touching something that didn't belong to the glamorous world she was used to. The box felt cold in her hands. The scratched metal reflected the golden lights of the hotel behind them, making it look out of place amidst the evening gowns, diamonds, and expensive glasses of champagne. Victoria tried to open the lid. It wouldn't open. Ethan spoke very softly. The lock's been stuck for a long time. Push it gently to the left first. Victoria did as he said. A small click echoed. The lid slowly opened. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry. Nothing that looked valuable in the way the wealthy people around her would care about. Just a few old items faded with time. A stack of old photographs, faded garage receipts, a carefully folded handwritten letter, a safe deposit box key, and a few photos so old their corners had started to curl up. Victoria picked up the first photograph. Her gaze immediately froze. In the photo was a much younger Richard Hayes, wearing a work jacket stained with machine oil, standing next to the old Mustang in front of a small snow-covered garage in Denver. Beside him was an Ethan from about 20 years ago. They were both smiling. Not the polite social smile for the press, but the genuine smile of people who had gone through hard times together. Victoria frowned. Her father had never shown her any pictures like this. In her memory, Richard Hayes always appeared in expensive suits, with private helicopters and business parties in five-star hotels. Not an old, snow-covered garage, not hands stained with machine oil. She picked up another photo. This time it was Richard sitting on the concrete floor of the garage with a little girl about 5 years old, Lily. The little girl was smiling brightly while Richard handed her a sugar-coated donut. On the back of the photo, her father's familiar handwriting appeared. Best mechanic assistant in Denver. Victoria felt her throat go dry. She looked at Ethan. Your daughter? Ethan nodded slightly. Lily. Victoria continued to go through the papers inside. They were old garage invoices from nearly 10 years ago. The customer's name was handwritten: Richard Hayes, Mustang Ing maintenance, engine replacement, transmission repair. Every single invoice was signed by Ethan. A nearby influencer whispered to their camera that this was starting to feel more like a family secret than a typical scandal. Victoria could barely hear anything around her anymore. She opened the next handwritten letter, but before she could read it, her eyes landed on a small envelope tucked underneath. Inside was a hospital bill. Patient's name, Claire Miller. Your wife? Ethan glanced toward the old Mustang out there before answering. She's gone. Victoria was silent. For the first time since Ethan had appeared, the voices around them began to fade. Ethan didn't look at her as he continued. Years ago, Claire had cancer. The insurance wasn't enough to cover the treatment. I did almost everything I could just to keep her alive for a few more months. His voice was painfully calm. I fixed cars during the day. At night, I ran deliveries. Sometimes I'd even sleep in the garage because I didn't have enough gas money to drive home. Victoria unconsciously tightened her grip on the letter. Her father had never told her anything like this. Ethan continued. I almost lost our home back then. He paused for a few seconds, then looked at the box. Your father was the only one who helped me in secret. A cold wind blew across the red carpet. Behind the glass of the ballroom, elegant jazz music still played amidst crystal lights and expensive champagne, while right outside the hotel doors, a past of poverty Victoria never knew was slowly being revealed, piece by piece. She looked down at the safe deposit box key lying at the bottom of the box. The top of the key had the logo of an old bank in downtown Denver. Victoria frowned. What is this? Ethan shook his head slightly. I've never opened it. Your father said the key belongs only to the Hayes family. Victoria looked at him doubtfully. Then why did you keep it for all these years? Ethan was silent for a few long seconds because I promised him. A heavy silence fell over the red carpet area. Even a few of the people who were live streaming earlier started to lower their phones. Victoria slowly opened the last handwritten letter in the box. It was Richard Hayes' handwriting. She recognized it almost instantly. Vic's heart beat faster as her eyes landed on the first line. If Victoria ever forgets where this empire came from, give her this car. Victoria stood frozen in the entrance of the Sterling Grand Hotel. Her father's letter still open in her hand, while dozens of eyes watched for the slightest reaction on the face of a woman who always appeared so perfect before the media. The snow continued to fall gently over the red carpet. The old Mustang sat silently under the yellow lights, a piece of the past dragged right into the middle of the lavish world Victoria had spent her entire life protecting. She looked up at Ethan. How long have you known about this? Ethan leaned gently against the old car, breathing out a thin puff of vapor into the cold air. Since before Hayes Prestige Motors had its first showroom. Victoria gripped the letter tighter. That seemed almost impossible to her. In Victoria's memory, her father had always been the kind of businessman born from success. A man who appeared in Forbes magazine, flew in a private helicopter, and shook hands with politicians in five-star hotels. Not someone who slept in an old car, not a poor mechanic, not someone who was once thrown out of a hotel. But Ethan looked at her with a calm gaze, as if he were seeing a girl who never truly knew her own father. Years ago, your father slept in that Mustang for nearly 6 months. Victoria's head snapped up. What? Ethan nodded slightly. After his first garage went bankrupt, he lost almost everything. No one wanted to lend money to a poor mechanic. No one wanted to invest in a man who fixed cars with hands covered in engine grease. A cold wind blew across the hotel's front courtyard. The sound of jazz music from the ballroom behind them still drifted out luxurious and in complete contrast to the story Ethan was telling. He slept right there in the back seat of that Mustang during the Denver winter. There were nights the temperature dropped below -10 degrees. I had to bring him into my garage to sleep because I was afraid he'd freeze to death. Victoria said nothing. She had never heard any story like this. Ethan looked toward the brightly lit glass windows of the Sterling Grand Hotel and let out a soft, humorless laugh. It's ironic, isn't it? Victoria frowned. What do you mean? Ethan was silent for a few seconds before answering. 30 years ago, your father was kicked out of this very hotel by security. Victoria froze. That's impossible. You might not know this, but the Sterling Grand used to be owned by another corporation before Hayes acquired it. Ethan looked her straight in the eye. Richard Hayes once walked in here to meet an investor. The suit he was wearing then was even older than my jacket is today. He paused, letting the words sink in. The security guard at the time said he was dirtying the hotel lobby. An unsettling feeling began to churn in Victoria's chest. She turned to look at the security team standing near her, then back at Ethan, standing beside his old Mustang among a long line of million-dollar supercars. The scene before her was almost identical to the story he had just told. A few guests began to whisper to each other. The murmuring grew louder than before. Someone started pulling up the first live stream to compare the scene of Victoria kicking Ethan out of the hotel with Richard Hayes' past. A reporter spoke in a low voice to a colleague. If this is true, this will be the biggest scandal Hayes' prestige has faced in years. Inside the ballroom, the luxurious atmosphere began to shift palpably. The guests, who were initially focused on the fleet of supercars, were now barely looking at the stage. They were looking out through the glass, looking at Ethan, looking at the old Mustang, looking at the CEO who was slowly losing her perfect composure. Victoria felt a sting of irritation as the image she had built for years began to crack right in front of the media. She had always believed her father was a symbol of modern success, an entrepreneur born to win, not a man who once slept in his car, not a man who once fixed engines in a snow-covered garage, not a man who had been looked down upon, just like Ethan was tonight. Victoria looked at the stack of old photos again. In another photo, a young Richard Hayes stood in front of a small garage with a worn-out sign that read, Hayes Auto Repair, no showroom, no supercars, no five-star hotel. Just a small garage covered in snow and engine oil. Ethan spoke softly. He built Hayes Prestige Motors from that very place. Victoria stared at the photograph for a long time. A part of her wanted to deny everything, to believe that Ethan was trying to manipulate her emotions. But her father's handwriting was real. The photographs were real. And the look in his eyes in those pictures. That was real too. It was the look of a man who was happy in a way Victoria had never seen on any of his magazine covers. A nearby influencer started whispering to their camera that this story was no longer just rich people drama, but was turning into a true Hayes family secret. Victoria tried to summon her usual icy tone. If my father truly trusted you so much, why have I never heard your name? Ethan looked down at the metal box. Because he never wanted anyone to know just how poor he once was. The answer left Victoria speechless. A major investor for Hayes Prestige stepped out of the ballroom and pulled her aside. Victoria, the press is shifting their entire focus to this. We need to get this under control now. Before she could answer, a reporter's phone buzzed loudly in the crowd. The man glanced at his screen, then his head shot up. Wait! He looked at Victoria with a stunned expression. We just checked Richard Hayes' trust records. Victoria frowned. What do you mean? The reporter swallowed hard. There's a secret trust fund, one that's never been disclosed before. The air around them instantly went still. Victoria took a step forward. What trust? The man looked back at the document on his phone. Before he passed away, Richard Hayes transferred 40% of the Hayes Legacy Foundation shares into a private trust. Victoria felt her heart begin to race. She had never heard of it, and what sent a chill down her spine was the first name listed on that secret trust's records, Ethan Miller. Less than 20 minutes after the live stream in front of the Sterling Grand Hotel went viral on social media, the entire atmosphere of the supercar launch began to shift in a way Victoria Hayes had never experienced in her entire career running Hayes Prestige Motors. At first, it was just a few short video clips. A female CEO standing in the middle of a luxurious five-star hotel, ordering security to throw out a single father because his old car was ruining the event's image. But then, the internet started doing what the internet does. Every camera angle was spliced together. Every word was cut into short clips. Every one of Victoria's cold expressions was screenshotted and spread across every platform in minutes. Especially the moment Ethan stood by his old Mustang in the snow. while behind him a long line of gleaming Ferraris and Rolls-Royces shone brightly. That image almost instantly became a symbol of the contrast between wealth and dignity. A hashtag started climbing to the top of the trending lists in Denver: the single dad mechanic. Inside the ballroom, the guests were no longer focused on the new supercar collection. They were looking at their phones, reading comments, watching the live stream, listening to the whispers that began to spread across the room. A famous influencer standing by the champagne bar whispered to her friend that her view count had increased tenfold since Ethan appeared. Another investor snapped his laptop shut in frustration. Victoria realized the problem was no longer about the old Mustang. It was about her perfect image crumbling right before the public's eyes. She turned to her company's communications team. "Shut this down now." But before she could get a response, a PR staffer walked over, his face pale. "Mom, it's getting worse." Victoria snatched the phone. On the screen, thousands of comments were appearing continuously under the live stream. She humiliated a working father in public. That old mechanic probably has more dignity than every billionaire in that ballroom. Her father built you this company from nothing, and she forgot where she came from. Victoria gripped her phone tighter. Then another video appeared. It was the clip of Ethan answering Lily's phone call. "Daddy, did they like Grandpa Richard's car?" The clip was less than 10 seconds long, but the comment section nearly exploded. People no longer saw Ethan as an outsider who had wandered into an event for the super rich. They saw him as a father trying to keep a promise to the man who had saved his family. And Victoria was starting to look like the villain in the very story about legacy that she had just delivered on stage less than an hour ago. The air in the ballroom gradually became suffocating. The jazz music was still playing. Champagne was still being poured. But everything now felt like a party that was slowly sinking, and no one dared to say it out loud. A reporter hurried across the lobby and asked loudly, "Victoria, do you have any comment on insulting a single father in front of the media?" Another person cut in. "Is it true that the Hayes Legacy Foundation has cut numerous community support programs under your leadership?" Victoria whipped around. "Who told you that?" No one answered directly, because by now the internet had already started digging deep into the Hayes empire. An old article was reshared, then another. After that came interviews with early employees who had worked with Richard Hayes in a small garage in Denver 30 years ago. An elderly man appeared on a local channel's live stream, his hands still covered in motor oil. He looked straight into the camera and said slowly, "Richard Hayes used to pay for car repairs for people who couldn't afford it. But after he passed away, things started to change." Another former employee spoke up, saying that many free vocational training programs for poor youth had been shut down to cut marketing costs. A woman who used to work for the Hayes Legacy Foundation's charity revealed that the community support budget had been drastically reduced in the last 2 years, while the company spent millions of dollars on supercar events and influencer campaigns. Victoria felt the entire room slowly turning its back on her. The guests who had been clamoring to take photos with her just moments ago now started to avoid her gaze. Some investors quietly left the ballroom. The sound of high heels clicking on the vast marble floor sounded colder than usual. Outside in the hotel lobby, Ethan was still standing next to his old Mustang. He watched everything unfold with a look of weariness more than anger. He had never wanted any of this to happen. He just wanted to deliver the box and go home to his daughter. Ethan looked at his watch. It was almost 10 p.m. Lily was probably still awake. Just then his phone vibrated again. This time Lily's voice was much quieter than before. "Daddy." "Yeah, kiddo." "Daddy, are you okay?" That short question made Ethan close his eyes for a few seconds, as if all the chaos around him had suddenly become distant. On the other end of the line, he could hear the faint sound of a neighbor's TV and the clink of a spoon against a mug of hot chocolate. "You should be asleep, but I saw you on Mrs. Carter's phone." Ethan let out a soft sigh. "I'm okay." Lily was silent for a few seconds, then asked again in a very small voice, "Did they yell at you again?" It felt like a fist was squeezing Ethan's heart in his chest. Behind him, the five-star hotel was still blazing with light. The wealthy guests were still buzzing about the scandal, but in that moment, Ethan's world shrank to the sound of his daughter's voice. "It's all right, Lily." He tried to keep his voice gentle. "I'll be home soon," the little girl answered softly. "Okay, Daddy." The call ended. Ethan lowered his phone and stared at the old Mustang for a long time. The car was so old it was practically worthless in the eyes of the wealthy people around him. But it was once the place where Richard Hayes had slept through the coldest winter of his life. And now it was dragging a multi-million-dollar empire down with a truth that had been buried for years. Inside the ballroom, as Victoria was trying to regain control of the meeting with the board of directors, an elderly man stood up from the back of the room. Harold Bennett, the longest-serving member of the Hayes Prestige Motors Board. He looked at Victoria with a heavy gaze. "You never opened Richard's personal safe after he passed away, did you?" Victoria froze. An immediate silence fell over the room. Harold slowly walked closer. "If that key is real, then I think it's time you opened that safe. Tonight." 11 o'clock at night. Downtown Denver was nearly blanketed in snow as Victoria Hayes's black SUV pulled up to an old bank building, less than a 10-minute drive from the Sterling Grand Hotel. No more stage lights, no more jazz music, no more champagne or the crowd of influencers that usually surrounded her. There was only a CEO sitting silently in her car with an old silver key in her hand, while her phone buzzed incessantly with hundreds of calls from the press, the board, and the crisis communications team. Victoria turned off the screen. For the first time in years, she didn't want to hear from anyone else. Harold Bennett got out of the car behind hers and slowly walked into the bank with her. The man, nearly 70 years old, pulled his collar up against the cold wind, his gaze heavy as if he had long foreseen this day would come. Richard Hayes' safe was located in a private vault in the basement, reserved for the bank's long-standing VIP clients. The small room, bathed in a cold, yellow light, was a world away from the lavish luxury of the Sterling Grand. No marble, no crystal, no cameras, just the sound of a metal lock echoing in the quiet space. The bank employee inserted the key, then stepped back. Victoria stepped forward. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the key for the first time. A soft click echoed. The safe deposit box slowly opened. Inside, there were no gold bars or secret financial records like she had imagined. There were only three things: an old video cassette, a thick stack of legal documents carefully tied with string, and an envelope with her name written in Richard Hayes' familiar handwriting. Victoria felt her throat go dry. Harold stood behind her, saying nothing. She slowly opened the envelope. "Victoria, if you are reading this, it means I'm no longer here to tell you myself the things I should have said a long, long time ago." Victoria's eyes fell. Harold glanced at the video cassette, then spoke softly. "The security room upstairs still has an old player. We can watch it there." 10 minutes later, Victoria sat in the small surveillance room, bathed in the pale blue light of an old monitor as the tape began to play with a soft whirring sound in the quiet space. Then, Richard Hayes appeared on the screen. He looked older than Victoria remembered. More tired. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit. He wasn't standing in a supercar showroom. He was just sitting in the old familiar garage with the Mustang behind him. The yellow light fell upon his calloused hands. Richard stared directly into the camera for a long moment before speaking. "If you're watching this video, it means you've become the kind of person I always feared you would be." Victoria froze instantly. Harold slowly lowered his head. Richard continued. "Someone who thinks money is more important than people. Someone who's forgotten how much it hurts to be looked down on when you have nothing." Victoria's hands clenched tighter. Her father's voice on the video was calm, as always, but this time it didn't sound like one of his speeches for the media. It sounded more like a confession. "I spent my entire life building Hayes Prestige Motors, but the thing I was proudest of was never the supercars or the five-star hotels." Richard looked down at the garage floor for a few seconds, then looked up again. "It was the people who helped me get back on my feet when I had nothing left." Victoria felt her heart begin to grow heavy. Then that name appeared, Ethan Miller. Richard let out a long, slow breath before continuing. "If you think Ethan owes the Hayes family anything, you've got it all wrong." Victoria's head snapped up. Harold also watched the screen in silence. Richard continued, "The one who's truly in debt is me." A silence stretched for several seconds in the surveillance room. Outside the glass, snow was still falling, blanketing downtown Denver. Victoria felt her head start to spin as Richard went on to tell the story of the early years of Hayes Prestige Motors. After his first bankruptcy, Richard nearly lost his entire small garage because he couldn't pay the bank. He owed rent on the space, owed money for parts, out his employees their wages. No one wanted to lend more money to a poor mechanic. Even my own family turned their backs on me. Richard gave a bitter laugh in the video. I thought I was going to die in that old Mustang out there. Victoria had never heard her father speak with a voice like that. He was no longer the powerful billionaire, just an old man remembering the hardest time of his life. Then Richard looked straight into the camera. Ethan was the only one who didn't abandon me. Victoria felt her hands grow cold. Richard explained that Ethan wasn't doing any better at the time. Claire was seriously ill. Hospital bills were piling up. He and his wife were about to lose their home. But just as Richard was about to lose his first garage, Ethan did something he would never forget. Richard bowed his head for a few seconds in the video, as if the guilt still weighed on him even after all these years. Ethan sold his last home to save my garage. Victoria shot up from her chair. The air in the room froze. Harold closed his eyes slowly, as if he had known this for a long time. Victoria turned to him. You knew about this? Harold was silent for a few seconds, then gave a slight nod. Richard didn't want anyone to know. Victoria turned back to the screen. Richard was holding an old photograph of the Hayes Auto Repair Garage. Without Ethan Miller, Hayes Prestige Motors would have disappeared 30 years ago. His voice grew heavy. There would be no showroom, no five-star hotel. The million-dollar empire you're living in wouldn't exist. Victoria's chest felt so heavy she could barely breathe. An image of Ethan standing outside the Sterling Grand Hotel in the freezing snow suddenly flashed through her mind. The worn-out coat, the scuffed shoes, the faded Mustang. The man she had just publicly humiliated in front of the entire media. Richard looked directly into the camera one last time. If Ethan ever appears before you with that Mustang, remember that you're looking at one of the reasons the Hayes family is still standing today. The screen faded to black. The video ended. The room fell into absolute silence. Victoria stood motionless for a long time. For the first time in her life, she realized the man she'd treated like a nobody outside the hotel had actually helped build the entire world she always thought was rightfully hers. After midnight, rain began to fall over Denver. It wasn't the white snow from earlier at the Sterling Grand Hotel, but a cold, steady rain that streaked across the windshield of Victoria Hayes' car as she drove through the dark streets of the city's south side. She didn't go back to her penthouse. She didn't call the media. She didn't meet with her lawyers. The entire drive, her father's video played on a loop in her mind, impossible to shut off. Without Ethan Miller, Hayes Prestige Motors would have vanished 30 years ago. For the first time in years, Victoria felt unsure of who she even was anymore. Her SUV finally came to a stop in front of a small garage in an old working-class Denver neighborhood. The sign above the door read, Miller Auto Repair. A warm yellow light spilled from inside the garage, reflecting on the wet pavement. It felt like she was standing at the edge of a world completely different from the lavish ballrooms and five-star hotels she knew. Victoria sat in her car for a few moments, perfectly still. Through the fogged-up windshield, she could see Ethan, hunched underneath an old pickup truck, no staff to help him, no cameras, no one applauding his work, just the clank of metal tools echoing in the late night. The clock on the garage wall showed it was nearly 1 in the morning. It hit Victoria that he was still working after everything that had happened tonight. A food delivery car pulled up outside the garage. The driver got out, handed Ethan a small paper bag, and quickly drove away. Victoria frowned. Just then, Mrs. Carter from the house across the street walked over with Lily, who was wearing a tiny pink coat and clutching an old backpack to her chest. The moment she saw Ethan, the little girl ran into the garage. Daddy. Ethan immediately put down his tools, kneeling to welcome his daughter. Lily threw her arms around his neck, holding on as if he were her entire world. Inside her car, Victoria sat frozen. She didn't understand why such a simple sight could make her own chest feel so heavy. Ethan stroked his daughter's hair, a weary smile on his face. Why are you still awake? Lily held out the small box in her hands. I saved a cookie for you, Daddy. Ethan let out a very soft laugh. Thanks, Peanut. The little girl sat down on an old chair in the garage and began chattering away about school, her math test, and how Mrs. Carter let her watch cartoons before bed. All the while, Ethan worked on the car, listening as if nothing else in the world was more important than his daughter's words. Victoria watched the scene through the rain-streaked glass, a sense of guilt growing in a way she couldn't control. She remembered the moment she called Ethan, someone who didn't belong at the Sterling Grand. She remembered the laughter of the crowd. She remembered the calm look in his eyes as everyone filmed his humiliation. And now, here was that man. Just a father, working late into the night to provide for his child. Victoria got out of her car. The cold rain immediately soaked the shoulders of her coat. The sound of the garage door opening made Ethan look up. His expression changed the instant he saw Victoria standing under the yellow light. Lily turned around too. She looked a little surprised. It's the lady from the hotel. Victoria barely knew how to react to that innocent voice. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and stood up straight. It's late. Victoria looked around the small garage. Old walls, tools that had been used for years. An old heater buzzed softly in the corner. A small folding cot was set up behind a cloth curtain. She suddenly understood that Ethan sometimes slept right here. Victoria looked at Lily. You should be in bed. Lily shook her head quickly. I'm waiting for Dad to finish. Then she smiled, completely naturally. Daddy says customers need their cars in the morning. That simple sentence silenced Victoria. For the first time, she realized the true difference between her world and Ethan's. She used to think success was appearing in Forbes magazine, hosting supercar events at five-star hotels, and having everyone admire you. But here, in this place, success was simply a father staying awake until 1 in the morning so his daughter could keep going to school. Victoria looked at Ethan. You work like this all night, every night? Ethan just shrugged. I fix cars here during the day, deliver food for a few hours at night. On weekends, I fix trucks out in the suburbs. Victoria stopped short. 3 jobs. You're working 3 jobs just to keep life running for the two of you. Lily suddenly chimed in, her voice full of pride. Daddy is the best mechanic in Denver. Ethan chuckled softly. You should be asleep. But Lily continued as if she couldn't stop bragging about her dad. Daddy can fix anything. The little girl looked up at Victoria, her eyes completely serious. Grandpa Richard said Daddy never gives up on people. At that, Ethan lowered his head slightly. Victoria felt a lump form in her throat. After a few moments of silence, she asked softly, Did Richard really help with Lily's school tuition? Ethan nodded, just a small part. He glanced toward the old Mustang out in the rain. He wanted to help more, but I wouldn't take it. Victoria frowned. Why? Ethan was silent for a few seconds. Because he'd already done too much. Victoria looked at him for a long time. She realized that in this small garage there was no sign of the greed she had suspected. No expensive watch, no new car, no demands for money, no lawsuits, no media. This man had kept Richard Hayes' secret for years without ever demanding anything in return. The rain continued to fall on the garage roof. The yellow light cast over Ethan's tired face as he turned back to work on the old pickup truck. Single father exhaustion was evident in his every movement. Slow, heavy, bone-tired. But when Lily talked about school, Ethan listened as if it were the most important thing in the world. Victoria had never seen a man like him in the business world she knew. She slowly opened the folder she'd brought with her from the bank. Tucked between the legal documents was the last letter Richard Hayes had left behind. Victoria opened it. Her father's familiar handwriting appeared under the old yellow light of the small garage. Respect people before money makes you blind. The next morning, Denver awoke to the biggest scandal Hayes Prestige Motors had ever faced since the day the company was founded. Every local news channel was replaying the video of Victoria Hayes ordering security to remove Ethan Miller from the Supercar event at the Sterling Grand Hotel, while footage showed his old snow-dusted Mustang parked between a long line of Ferraris and Rolls-Royces. But what made the public outcry explode wasn't just the humiliation. It was the truth that was beginning to emerge behind it. Investigative articles were published continuously, one after another, in just a matter of hours. Reporters dug up the records of the Hayes Legacy Foundation. The free vocational training programs that Richard Hayes had once funded for underprivileged youth had their budgets cut 2 years ago. The free car repair fund for military veterans had vanished without explanation. The support program for single parents in Denver had also been shut down to funnel money into luxury brand promotion campaigns and multi-million-dollar supercar launches. Victoria Hayes' name began to appear in every news headline. The heiress who forgot her father's legacy. The billionaire CEO who humiliated a single father. From garage dreams to luxury empire scandal. The situation was so bad that many of Hayes Prestige Motors' major partners immediately pulled out of the event that very morning. A luxury watch brand canceled its sponsorship deal. Two investors announced they were suspending their partnership until an internal investigation was concluded. The VIP guests who had appeared on the red carpet the night before quietly deleted photos with Victoria from their social media. A few influencers even posted public apology videos for having laughed at Ethan during their live streams. In the vast ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel, the staff dismantled the stage in silence. The Hayes Prestige Motors banners were rolled up. Half-empty champagne glasses still sat on the tables like the last traces of a party that had died overnight. Victoria stood alone in the middle of the empty ballroom. There was no more applause, no more camera flashes. No one looked at her like a symbol of success anymore. Her phone kept vibrating nonstop. The lawyer, the investors, the PR advisor, the board of directors. But this time, no one was calling to congratulate her. A cold voice spoke from behind. "We need to meet, right now." Victoria turned around. Harold Bennett and three other board members were walking toward her. No one was bothering with their usual diplomatic demeanor. The third-floor meeting room of the hotel became heavy with tension within minutes. Media reports were scattered across the table. A chart showed Hayes Prestige Motors stock plummeting from the moment the market opened. A board member threw a tablet on the table. "This scandal is killing the company." Another person cut in. "It's not just the scandal. The press is starting to investigate Richard Hayes' secret trust fund." Victoria clenched her fists. "I can handle this." Harold looked at her for a long time before replying. "That's precisely what we're no longer sure of." The room fell silent for a few seconds. Then Harold pushed a file folder toward Victoria. "According to the board's emergency charter, you are temporarily suspended from your position as CEO until the investigation is complete." Victoria was stunned into silence. She looked at each person in the room. The very people who had toasted champagne with her last night were now avoiding her eyes, as if she were a problem to be disposed of as quickly as possible. Victoria shot to her feet. "You can't do this to me," a board member replied coldly. "This company cannot afford to go down with you." Those words hit Victoria harder than any article on the internet. For the first time in her life, she truly felt the loss of something she thought would last forever. Power, reputation, position, family, everything had started to slip through her fingers in less than 24 hours. Meanwhile, when in Aja in South Tenfenberg, Ethan Miller was changing the oil on an old truck as if the world outside wasn't collapsing. The radio in the garage played nonstop news about the Hayes Prestige Motors scandal. Victoria's name was everywhere, but Ethan felt no joy. He slowly turned off the radio and went back to work. Because more than anyone, Ethan understood how painful it was to lose a family. He had watched Claire lie in a hospital bed as the medical bills grew beyond their means. He'd lost their first home. He'd slept in a garage with his daughter. He'd watched everything fall apart, powerless to stop it. So even though Victoria had humiliated him in front of everyone, Ethan felt no satisfaction in watching her fall. A cold rain continued to fall over Denver that evening. Just before 10 p.m., the bell on the garage door rang. Ethan wiped his hands and walked out. Victoria Hayes was standing in the rain. No evening gown, no diamonds, no media team, no bodyguards. She wore a simple dark coat, her hair damp from the rain, and her eyes looked more tired than Ethan had ever seen. For the first time since he'd met her, Victoria didn't look like the CEO of Hayes Prestige Motors. She just looked like a woman who had just realized that the entire world she trusted might have been built on truths she never understood. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. "You shouldn't be here." Victoria looked around the small garage. The smell of engine oil, the old yellow light, the sound of rain tapping gently on the tin roof. It was all so completely different from her world. Victoria spoke softly. I don't know what to do anymore." Her voice was so much softer now, a faint echo of the woman who had stood in the center of the ballroom the night before. Ethan didn't answer right away. He simply turned back to tightening a bolt under the car, as if he still wasn't used to having a billionaire standing in his garage. Victoria glanced around, and her eyes landed on a small table in the back of the garage. Lily was slumped over it, fast asleep. She was hugging an old backpack, her head pillowed on a coloring book, a small yellow lamp still glowing above her. It was as if she'd tried to stay up, waiting for Dad to finish his work, but had finally drifted off to the sound of the rain and the familiar smell of old engine oil. Rain kept falling outside Ethan Miller's small garage, tracing long streaks down the old glass panes as the yellow light from within reflected off the cement floor, stained dark with years of engine oil. Victoria Hayes stood silently by the table where Lily slept, while Ethan continued to work under the pickup truck as if her presence did nothing to disturb the familiar rhythm of the place. The soft clink of a metal tool echoed in the garage. Slow, steady. Weary, Victoria had never spent more than 10 minutes in a space like this in her entire life. No elegant music, no staff, no one trying to impress anyone. Just a father still working past midnight so his daughter could sleep peacefully on an old chair nearby. Victoria watched Lily for another moment before speaking softly. "I'm sorry." Ethan didn't answer right away. He gave one final turn to the bolt, then slowly slid out from under the truck. He got to his feet, wiping his hands on an old rag dark with grease. For the first time, Victoria looked him straight in the eye, all her arrogance gone. "I'm sorry for everything that happened at the Sterling Grand." Ethan was silent for a few seconds. The reflection of the rain on the glass behind them seemed to deepen the silence in the garage. Finally, he spoke. It wasn't about the words. Victoria froze. Ethan glanced over at the old Mustang parked out in the rain. "It's that you've forgotten how to see other people as human." His words weren't loud. They weren't angry, but they hit Victoria harder than any headline or scandal from the past 2 days. Because for the first time, she realized Ethan had never been trying to humiliate her. He only showed up to keep a promise to her father. She was the one who had turned the whole thing into a humiliation from the very start. Victoria lowered her head, very slowly. A flood of moments replayed in her mind, moments she had never before seen as wrong. The servers whose names she never bothered to learn, the laborers she saw only as cogs in a machine, the charities she'd cut simply because they didn't offer enough brand value, and Ethan's steady gaze, unflinching, amid the laughter of the wealthy crowd that night. Victoria asked softly, "So my father, he was really like you?" Ethan leaned against the old workbench. "He was poorer than I am." Victoria let out a tiny laugh, but this time it was filled with bitterness. "I don't think I ever really knew him." Ethan didn't answer, because they both knew it was true. In the days that followed, Victoria practically vanished from the world she had always known. No more appearances at events, but no more statements to the media, no more live streams or glamorous interviews. Instead, she began to do something she never thought she would. She started seeking out the people who had worked with Richard Hayes from the very beginning. An old garage in the suburbs of Denver, a small diner where the mechanics used to gather after work, a dusty parts warehouse that once belonged to Hayes Auto Repair. Victoria met the first-generation employees who had been forgotten for years. Old men with gray hair who still remembered Richard Hayes working alongside them, fixing cars with his own hands until 3 in the morning. One told her how Richard paid his employees in full, even when he himself had to sleep in his car. Another said Richard hated seeing anyone look down on just for being poor. Victoria listened to it all in silence. Every story was like a hammer blow, shattering the glamorous image she had built of the Hayes empire. Then she started visiting the places the Hayes Legacy Foundation had supported before she cut its funding. A vocational center now shuttered, a free auto repair shop for veterans now abandoned, a support program for single parents now just an empty room with a few old chairs. An elderly woman recognized Victoria as she stepped into the old community center. She looked at her for a long time, then asked, "Do you have any idea how many people survived because of this program?" Victoria couldn't answer, because for the first time, she was truly seeing the consequences of decisions she had once treated as mere numbers on a financial report. At night, Victoria began to read through all of Richard Hayes' journals, kept in the safe, hundreds of old pages, lines of handwriting from the middle of the night, notes about the first garage, the times he almost went bankrupt, the nights spent sleeping in his Mustang during the Denver winters. And Ethan Miller's name appeared again and again, not because he had money, because he stayed. Victoria read that line over and over for a long time. She slowly realized that Richard Hayes had never built this empire to worship money. He built it so that no one would ever have to feel as invisible as he once did. But over time, Victoria herself had turned it all into the very thing her father feared most, a brand that knew only luxury and power. Late one night, Victoria sat alone in the darkened office of Hayes Prestige Motors. Outside, the city of Denver glowed with cold, distant lights. She stared at her old speech on the laptop screen, then shut it. Then, she opened her phone. Thousands of articles still flooded her feed, all of them criticizing her. But for the first time, Victoria no longer felt the need to protect her image. She picked up the phone and called her communications team tomorrow morning. Her voice was quiet, but firm. I am going to reveal the entire truth to the press. 3 days after the scandal at the Sterling Grand Hotel, nearly all of Denver's media converged on one location, the Sterling Grand Hotel, the place where everything began. But this time, there were no spotlights on supercars, no champagne, no influencers laughing in front of rows of Ferraris and Rolls-Royces. The luxurious ballroom, which once hosted a multi-million-dollar launch, had been rearranged into a massive press conference hall, packed with hundreds of reporters. Television cameras lined the room. National news channels were broadcasting live. Victoria Hayes's name was still on the large screen behind the podium, but this time it wasn't paired with the image of a powerful CEO. Instead, below it were the words, "Public statement regarding Hayes Legacy Foundation." In the 10 minutes before the press conference began, the ballroom was filled with a low buzz of conversation. No one knew what Victoria was going to do. Some thought she would apologize to save the brand. Others believed it was just a final PR stunt before she was forced out. But then, the door behind the stage opened, and Victoria walked out. No evening gown, no diamonds, no entourage following her. She wore a simple dark suit. Her hair was tied back neatly, and she wore almost no makeup. For the first time, she looked more like a real person than the perfectly crafted media image she had maintained for years. The ballroom fell silent. Victoria stood at the microphone for a few long seconds. The harsh lights of the cameras were fixed on her face. Millions of people were watching the live stream across the country. She took a slow, deep breath. I used to think that success meant building an empire that other people would admire. Her voice no longer carried its usual sharp edge. It sounded tired, more real. But the past few days have made me realize that I completely misunderstood the meaning of the legacy my father left me. The atmosphere in the ballroom began to shift. Victoria glanced down at the papers in her hand, then continued. For years, the Hayes Legacy Foundation has cut numerous community support programs that my father once built. Free vocational training programs, the fund to support single parents, the auto repair centers for veterans. She looked up, staring directly into the hundreds of cameras before her. I am the one responsible for those decisions. A few camera shutters clicked relentlessly. Victoria continued, very slowly. I took a legacy built on help and gratitude and turned it into a promotional tool for an image of luxury. The ballroom was completely silent. No one saw her as that cold female CEO from that night anymore. Victoria opened the file in front of her. Starting today, all the money that was cut from the community programs will be fully reinstated. The Hayes Legacy Foundation will resume operations under a new structure. The vocational training centers that were closed will be reopened. The fund for single parents will be restored within this month. A murmur began to ripple through the audience. But Victoria wasn't finished. There is someone I need to apologize to in front of the entire country. She turned her head slightly toward the seats on the left side of the ballroom. The cameras immediately panned to follow her gaze. Ethan Miller was sitting at the end of the row, wearing his familiar old gray shirt and a dark jacket, frayed at the cuffs. He looked almost out of place in this luxurious ballroom. Next to Ethan was Lily. The little girl was wearing a light blue sweater, hugging her old backpack to her chest. Victoria looked at Ethan for a few seconds before continuing. I insulted a single father simply because his old car didn't fit the perfect image I wanted to build. Her voice began to slow. When the truth is, that man has sacrificed more than most of the wealthy people I have ever met in my life. An image of the old Mustang appeared on the large screen behind the stage. The ballroom grew so quiet you could hear the cameras swiveling. Victoria told them about the small garage in Denver, about the years Richard Hayes slept in that Mustang during the cold winters, about how Ethan had sold his last house to save Richard Hayes's first garage from bankruptcy. Many reporters started to look up from their laptops. A few people in the audience stopped typing. They just listened in silence. Victoria looked at Ethan. My father used to say that a man is measured not by the money he has, but by the people who still stand by his side when everything falls apart. For the first time, her voice almost broke. Ethan Miller is one of those people. A long silence filled the ballroom. Then, someone stood up. One person, then a few more. Just a few seconds later, nearly the entire ballroom rose to its feet, applauding. This wasn't the polite, obligatory applause of the business world. It was the kind of applause for a man whose true worth they finally understood. The cameras continuously focused on Ethan, but Ethan just gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow, as if he wasn't used to being the center of attention. Then he looked down at Lily. The little girl was smiling with pride. "Daddy, they like Grandpa Richard's car now." Ethan let out a soft chuckle. For the first time in days, the exhaustion in his eyes softened just a little. As the applause continued to echo through the ballroom, Victoria looked out at the hundreds of people below and took a deep breath. But there's still one last thing. A hush immediately fell over the room. Victoria opened the last file on the table. This is the last thing Richard Hayes left behind before he passed away. The ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel was still ringing with applause when Victoria Hayes opened the final document Richard Hayes had left before his death. The lights from dozens of cameras reflected off the old paper, which had yellowed slightly with time. Victoria looked down at her father's familiar handwriting for a long moment before speaking. This is the final provision in Richard Hayes's personal trust. The ballroom immediately fell silent again. Victoria read slowly. "The vintage Mustang with the Colorado 1979 license plate will never be sold, auctioned, or transferred in any form." She paused for a few seconds. "It must be kept as a symbol of the origins of Hayes Prestige Motors, to remind every future generation that this empire began with a man sleeping in his car in the middle of a Denver winter." The entire ballroom was silent. All eyes slowly turned toward the old Mustang, appearing on the large screen behind the stage. The faded car that had once been mocked no longer looked like a piece of scrap metal lost in a world of million-dollar machines. It looked like the true soul of the Hayes Empire. Victoria let out a soft breath and continued. "My father didn't build Hayes Prestige Motors to create more wealthy people who only know how to look down on others." Her voice grew deeper. "He built to give those who had been left behind by life another chance." Victoria looked at Ethan down in the ballroom. "Therefore, from this day forward, Richard Hayes's first garage will be restored." A few reporters immediately looked up. Victoria continued. "It will become a free vocational academy for those who cannot afford to attend college, for veterans, for those who have lost their jobs, and for single parents trying to raise their children, like Ethan Miller." The sound of camera shutters clicked incessantly once more. Victoria opened the file further away. "The Hayes Legacy Foundation will also establish a new scholarship fund for underprivileged children in Colorado. The name of the fund will be the Claire Miller Scholarship Program." Ethan instantly looked up. It was the first time since the press conference began that the calm composure on his face truly changed. Victoria looked at him very slowly. "Lily's mother deserves to be remembered as more than just an old hospital bill." The ballroom fell almost completely silent. A few people in the audience quickly began to wipe their eyes. Lily, sitting beside Ethan, gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, that's Mommy's name." Ethan looked at his daughter and gave a gentle nod. He didn't say anything else, because some emotions are too immense to be put into words. Victoria went on to announce that the Hayes Legacy Foundation would be reopening all of its support programs for single parents that had been closed, and pledged to use the majority of future profits for community projects instead of the multi-million-dollar luxury campaigns of the past. But what surprised the media most of all was when a reporter stood up and asked Ethan if he would agree to become the new face of the Hayes Legacy Foundation. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. A story like this was perfect for the media. The impoverished single father becomes a national icon. The news agencies could already see tomorrow's headlines. But Ethan just gave a slight shake of his head. "I don't want to be famous." The answer was so simple that a few people thought they had misheard. The reporter pressed on. "Then what do you want?" Ethan looked at Lily, who was sitting beside him. She was still hugging her old backpack to her chest, just like any other day. Then he answered, very slowly, "I just want to live a quiet life with my daughter." The ballroom fell silent once again. Because in a room full of people who always wanted more, the one man who had saved the entire Hayes Empire wanted nothing for himself. Victoria gave a slight bow of her head. For the first time in her life, she understood why her father had always respected Ethan Miller so deeply. The press conference ended nearly an hour later. Outside the Sterling Grand Hotel, snow began to fall gently again upon the brightly lit streets of Denver. The crowd of reporters gradually dispersed. The limousines departed one by one. But Ethan didn't linger. He led Lily to the old Mustang and helped her buckle her seatbelt, just like he did every day. No cameras, no posing, no attempt to play the hero. Just a father, getting ready to drive home after the longest day of his life. The Mustang slowly pulled away from the five-star hotel that had turned him away just days before. The Denver nightscape drifted past the window, bathed in the faint yellow glow of the streetlights. Lily sat in the back, hugging her backpack, watching her father in the rearview mirror. "Daddy, yeah, kiddo?" She was silent for a few seconds, as if pondering something very serious. Then, in a soft voice, she asked, "Daddy, do rich people always forget things?" 1 year later. Winter had returned to Denver, but this time the old garage on the small street in the south of the city was no longer dark and silent. The old wooden sign above the door had been restored: Miller Auto Repair and Training Center. The warm yellow light spilling out from inside the garage reflected on the thin layer of snow outside, creating a feeling of warmth amidst the late-year Colorado cold. The biggest difference wasn't the new sign. It was the people inside. The place where Ethan Miller once worked alone late into the night had now become a free vocational training center for those who had been left behind by life. Unemployed veterans, young people who couldn't afford college, single fathers trying to start over after a divorce or bankruptcy. In the right corner of the garage, an old pickup truck was having its engine removed by 3 young trainees under Ethan's guidance. At the far end of the garage was a free repair bay for the city's families in need. A single mother was in tears when she learned that the only car she had to get to work would be repaired for free. Outside the small office door, the center's notice board was covered with the first photos of graduates who had found jobs after completing the training. There were no luxury logos, no million-dollar ads, just real lives changing one by one. The old Mustang still sat in its familiar spot near the garage's eastern wall. The paint was still faded by the years. The engine still made the same old rumble every time it started. But now, no one laughed at it anymore. It had become the heart of this whole place, a symbol to remind everyone that even the greatest empires can start with a man sleeping in his car in the freezing winter. Victoria Hayes showed up at the garage a few times a week. No more bodyguards, no more media entourage trailing behind her. She wore a simple jacket, brought coffee for trainees herself, and would often sit for hours reading through the support files of struggling families that the Hayes Legacy Foundation was once again funding. The press still tried to take her picture every time she appeared. But Victoria barely paid it any mind anymore. She appeared on TV less, attended fewer luxury events, spoke less about the brand. Many in the business world thought she had completely changed after last year's scandal. But only Ethan understood that Victoria hadn't changed into someone else. She had simply, finally, become the person Richard Hayes had always hoped she would be. That afternoon, Lily ran around the garage, her hair much longer than before, and her red sweater baggier than last year's. She was older now, more confident, and she smiled a lot more. Lily climbed onto a small chair near the back wall and carefully hung up a new family photo next to the old pictures of Richard Hayes. In the photo, Ethan, Lily, and a few of the center's students stood next to the Mustang under the Denver snow. She jumped down and turned to Ethan, full of pride. "Daddy, now the wall looks full." Ethan looked at the photo-covered wall for a long time, then smiled softly. Yeah, it felt more like a home now. The evening light slowly faded outside the garage. One by one, the students went home. The sound of mechanical tools grew quieter. The laughter became less frequent. In the end, only Ethan was left, standing alone in the middle of the spacious garage, bathed in the familiar yellow light. He walked slowly around the garage, doing his final checks, just like every other day. He turned off the air compressor, covered the toolbox, locked the door to the parts storeroom. Outside, snow began to fall lightly over Denver again. Ethan stood before the old Mustang for a few long seconds. The yellow light reflected off the faded silver paint worn by time. The car still wasn't beautiful, not luxurious, not worth millions of dollars, but it had saved more lives than most of the expensive things out there. Ethan placed a hand gently on the hood, then looked around the garage one last time. The photos on the wall, the old tool sets, the cars in the middle of being repaired, the new opportunities that had just begun for so many people. Then he walked to the door. The sound of the garage door slowly rolling down echoed in the cold Denver night. One last gleam of yellow light reflected off the old Mustang before the door closed completely. Some people build empires from money, others build them from sacrifice. Only one of them lasts forever. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. In a world where people are often judged by their money, luxury cars, and status, we hope the story of Ethan Miller has reminded us that a person's true worth sometimes lies in the silent sacrifices no one ever sees. There are those who build entire empires with money, but there are also those who build up the lives of others with kindness, loyalty, and love for their family. And sometimes it's the simplest people who leave behind the greatest legacies. If this story touched your heart, please show a little love for all the fathers and mothers out there who are quietly trying their best every single day. We'll see you in the next story.